and whether it's mythology, organizing set of principles, or whatever it may be. And that leads us into what seems to be a fourth turning moment, which is the rise of the network state.
Right. So what's interesting
Does that make sense? Is that roughly the right line of thought?
I think that's right. I'd say, let me make one more kind of sum up comment on the last bit, and then let's go to these things. The concept of something that is particularist but looks universalist is like a common morph through history. You know, when the Soviet Union was actually the dominant version of communism, basically communism was whatever the Soviet Union wanted it to be. And if communism meant that you were allied with the Nazis, which they were in 1939 to invade Poland together under Molotov-Ribbentrop, suddenly communism was pro-Nazism, right? For 2 years, it was pro-Nazism, right? So communism was whatever they wanted it to be. It could be the new economic policy, when Lenin allowed some capitalism, it could be the Red Terror, it's whatever they want it to be, right? Christianity under, Catholicism, the Holy Roman Empire, obviously, this is a long period of history and there's lots of different things that happened, but it's pretty plastic too, over 1,000 years, it went from being Christianity went from being the slave religion that overthrew the Roman Empire to the master religion that ran, the Catholic Church and the Holy Roman Empire, right? Like basically you had this oxymoronic thing of the Christian king, And so this concept of something that sounds universalist but is particularist is very useful because you can just kind of people fool themselves and others with the words, right? But if you look at the actions, it's like in-group, out-group. Okay. And that in-group, out-group, today at least, we can think of it as subgraphs of a social network. This brings us to the concept of the networks and digital identity and the network state, right? This is the true map of the United States. It's a disunited States.
Yep.
Okay. And there's basically three maps. The first map is of the US in 1861. And what you see is that the two sides in 1861 are physically and ideologically separated, both at the same time, okay? So the Union and the Confederacy, and the thing we take for granted is that the geographical separation and the ideological separation coincide, okay?
Yeah.
What that means is that the victory condition in that Civil War was for the North to invade the South and take their capital, and then the South surrendered because, basically their communication structure, governance structure is all broken and they just gave up, right? Okay. Now, if we go forward, 150 something years to the next figure, the 2016 election, 2020 election is very similar, but county by county, it's fractal. The blue and the red, as opposed to blue and the gray, are cheek by jowl in lots of different states. And so there's no physical invasion plan or battle that's possible. What you have is instead, when you're going to invade a cornfield in Nebraska or San Francisco, it's like, and even then it'd be 30% Democrat or 30% Republican. You can't actually wage a physical fight, right? But if you go forward one more, you now see that in the digital space, which is what we talked about earlier, right? In that second world that's being created alongside, that blue and the red are actually quite disjoint.
That's very clear. That's the polarization that was allowable by the internet. The internet actually allowed the separation of political ideology and lack of centralization, right?
It was accelerating even before the internet. Right, but the internet accelerated. That is, say, it was happening, but the internet accelerated because cable news preceded the internet and the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine. Essentially, what happened by 1950 was like peak centralization, where it was like this massive centralizing force over many decades and centuries, mass media, mass production, telegraph, telephone, railroad, like that level of centralization. We sort of sometimes think of history as beginning in 1945, because the current era did, right? And people, if you ask them for the history of what happened before, they actually get pretty hazy. They're like, kind of Great Depression, Prohibition, then the Civil War, 1776, okay, and then go back to like Christianity, right? They basically just don't have any, right, memory of that, right? But there's some really interesting incidents. For example, in the 1600s, it's a very important one. The Puritans, or the ancestors of what we now call the Puritans, the Roundheads, lost a battle in, what is today the United Kingdom, and they went out to the northeast of America and settled there in like the early 1600s. And the mid 1600s, the Roundheads and their allies beat the Cavaliers. And the Cavaliers came out to like the Virginia area in like 1640-ish, if I remember correctly. And so what happened was two different sides on a civil war migrated out to the US, set up colonies, and 200 years later, those same two groups got into another civil war. that gives a completely different lens on like the Civil War. People say, oh, it's state rights or it's slavery. No, it's like, maybe it's Roundhead versus Cavalier. It's like literally, that's like this insane thing where this group, these cultural, these like mind viruses or what have you, are just things that are just powerful things that just, we don't understand them fully yet. It's kind of like not fully understanding human biology. We don't fully understand human sociology. We're still at the phlogiston theory there, like the mind viruses that kind of like mass and move large groups of people. Okay. And so these two groups are again kind of fighting now, right? Another 150 something years later. And so, that's why the US is not really a nation state, even though we use that term. Do you know the difference between the nation and the state? Can you rattle it off? No? Over the last 10 years, we've all learned to rattle off what the properties of a currency are, right? Currency it's a store of value, it's a medium exchange, and it's a unit of account, right? You've heard that a bunch of times probably, right? And we didn't really have to think about that in the 2000s. Like I couldn't rattle that off then, but now, once we thought about what is a currency, you have things that are currency-like, but not quite currencies. That was the big thing of the 2010s. Like, what is a currency, right?
So hold on, I'm going to guess this nation versus state. So nation, I'm thinking, is the physical place where you live that is guided by a certain set of rules, and the state is the set of rules.
Close. The nation is the people, and the state is government. Okay.
Right. Yeah.
And the land is yet like a third thing or whatever, which we can come back to. But so for example, it's a little bit old fashioned when people talk about, so one of the things about that, nation has the same like root, like as natality. So common birth, right? So common descent. So like the Japanese nation, right? And that's the Japanese people and culture and language and so on and so forth, as distinct from the Japanese state, which is this creamy layer of administrators above them. Okay, which could be the Japanese Empire, and then 1945, 46, it's like actually the American state above them, right? The state was not the people. The Japanese nation was different than the state. And then eventually they got the kind of democratic Japan installed there, right? And, like somebody who lived in East Germany actually like lived under 4 different states, right? They were under Weimar and then the Nazis and then the East Germans. And if they lived long enough, they got to like German reunification, right? So like one very long life. There's a good book on like My 4 Lives, somebody who lived through all 4 of those eras in Germany. If you lived like for about 80 years, you managed to make it all the way through, okay? World War and communism and so on. And so when you understand the difference between the nation and the state, you can actually start like decoding certain amazing things. So for example, the United Nations, is actually best not thought of as the United Nations, it's best thought of as the selected states. Why? Because there's 193 countries in the United Nations. But as the president of Kazakhstan recently acknowledged, if all the stateless nations, if all the Catalonians and Basques and Kurds and Armenians and so on and so forth, if all of them got their own states, he said there'd be 600 or 700 countries in the United Nations. So that's another interesting term, the stateless nation. Oh, okay. That like to sometimes understand what something is, you need to understand what it is not, and ideally something that's just on the boundary. It's like math, right? You have a definition and you probe that definition with something that has like 4 of the properties, but not the 5th, and then you can often get very interesting objects that are close, but not the same thing. And you only understand something when you understand the decision boundary for what is inside and outside the set. Yeah. And so when you see this, you realize, okay, a nation state, it's supposed to be, and this was the original concept, there's a group of people of common descent, and then they have the right to self-determination, meaning a government over them. That's what it used to be. Now, it actually turns out today, there's actually arguably relatively few countries in the world that satisfy the nation state definition. Japan does, Israel does, arguably, but China and India are a little different. They're more like civilization states because they're so big. They actually have multiple nationalities under them, right? India has Gujaratis and Tamilians and Malayalam, all these different ethnicities. China is actually 90-something% Han, so you can argue it's like one ethnic group, but they also do have like 10%, still like 100 million people from various other different ethnic groups. There is a feedback effect here because the state can actually homogenize and create a nation. For example, at the time of the French Revolution, Hobsbawm mentions that only a small percentage of what we think of as France today spoke French. They spoke other dialects of other things at that time. And then the revolutionary administration, revolutionary France, and its descendants basically smoothed all of that out into like the French of the Académie Française eventually, and that's why they're so prescriptive about it. They just homogenize this whole area. So France is a social construct. So is Italy. Garibaldi united it. So is Germany. Bismarck united it. And so essentially, in the language of like private equity or something, these roll-ups occurred where all these little principalities and city-states were all like rolled up into like these giant empires that we call France and Germany and Italy. And there's fragments, small fragments of the old world that survive to the present day. Do you know what San Marino is?
Small country off the coast in Italy, though. It's probably the smallest principality in the world, right?
Yeah, something like that. Exactly. I'm not sure it's the very smallest, but it's one of the smallest. It's like 30,000 people or something like that. Okay. And you look at it and you're like, why is this, a quote country? I don't understand. And the answer is that like it sheltered Garibaldi when he was like unifying Italy. And so he like spared it and like guaranteed sovereignty. And it managed to kind of just keep that all the way to the present day. So it's like this duck-billed platypus, this missing link that tells us what the old world used to look like. Okay. The thing is that there used to be lots and lots of these city-states, but they didn't have the defense capabilities to stand up against these nation states. So you teamed up into these large units, right? I mean, German nationalism and the whole German question arose in part as a result of all of the, of Napoleon and all the invasions. Like the Germans had to team up or else the French, were going to stomp them. That was actually what, a big part of the 1800s was about, right? And in more recent history, the Indians and the Chinese have, within living memory, basically unified their respective billion people, right? India, as you're probably aware, maybe some of your viewers aren't aware, they have both like, they have essentially two independence days, right? They have Republic Day and they have Independence Day, right? And the difference is there's a difference between the independence from the British and the fusion of the 562 princely states that made up India at the time of independence from the British into the Indian Union, right? So you're like, wait a second, the princely states? I've realized that this is something that people in India know, but that most people outside India don't know even existed. Do you know about the princely states? Yeah.
Yeah. I spent a long time in India. Yeah.
Okay. Why don't you talk about it? Because I'll keep going. Go ahead.
The history of India was, in fact, it was never one unified country. They were either tribal or principalities or kingdoms and split, and also religious ideologies. Everything was split. And all of the history of India is not India as a nation. It's the history of the ruling factors, who grew, who didn't, the Guptas, all of these people that moved around the state. And the most famous of all, even though they're probably the least significant, were the Rajasthani kings, because that's what we know, because that's where you go on holiday and you go to Udaipur and Jaipur and that kind of stuff. But yeah,
that's right.
And they were all, the Brits kind of gave them fake power. So they said, well, you are monarchs like our monarch, and therefore you can meet the king when he comes and this kind of stuff. But they basically took their power away. And then the Indian state took all of their land away as well, essentially, and all of their money and all of their power.
Yeah, exactly. It was a complicated process, but they did a bunch of deals with them. And they're like, okay, we're doing a deal with all the guys surrounding you. And if you don't join the Indian Union, we're going to roll you up too. Very similar to like the, plata y plomo deal that, was offered to lots of the city-states in Europe, right? Silver or lead, right? Point is that that unification of India is something that happened within living memory. If you're 80-something, people are actually around for when, like they were 7 or 10 or something like that at the time that that happened, right? So just slipping out of living memory. And so China also, I think it's very much a retcon, but like within China, Mao was 3 parts good and, like 7 parts good and 3 parts bad. It's about as negative as they can afford to be, with the pretense that the Communist Party was continuous. What actually happened is Deng Xiaoping ran a coup against Mao in the 70s and turned the whole thing around and changed it. But he kept the logo, right? He kept the branding in our terminology because, he wanted to preserve the illusion of continuity, since there had been so much chaos and so much revolution and so on in China. They didn't want yet another one. Didn't want to change the flag. He wanted everybody to think it was the same thing. And he just reinterpreted it to be like communism is whatever, Deng says it is. That's kind of the same thing we were talking about earlier. Universalism, particularism in the guise of universalism. Anyway, point is, both those two things were just unified as of recently. And the state has tried to essentially equate itself with the nation, and to varying levels of success. I think very high level of success in actually both of these regions. Nationalism is a big thing. These are two cultures that are very much on the rise, right? And this is why, the sovereign individual thesis, which I think is important, has a lot of qualifiers, because I think the future is a centralized East and a decentralized West. The Sinic and Dharmic civilizations are on the rise, and like the Abrahamic civilizations are broadly in decline. And, these are just like these gigantic cycles. And we just, when you learn enough history and you see these arcs, you're like, wow, this is this mega wave that I'm just in the middle of, when it was kind of going in the opposite direction, and we're at this turning of a lot of different things at the same time, right? The rise of India, the rise of China, relative decline of the West, rise of information technology, rise of artificial intelligence. It's like actually kind of insane how many different things are like flipping at the same time. It's like
a quick side question to that is, can the Sinic conglomeration